This is rock bottom for this Badgers football team.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers, your team every single day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Harings. As always, really do appreciate you tuning in. Today's episode, we are talking about Badgers football at its rock bottom spot, how we got here, and the culpability between Paul Chryst and Luke Fickell. But first, today's episode brought to you by our good friends over at FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. New customers can bet $5, get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, so I want to do the show because we do get so caught up in the day-to-day reacting to things on this show that sometimes you need to take a step back and really 30,000-foot view. Where are we at? This is rock bottom moment for the Badgers. This program has hit rock bottom. And I wanted to talk about some stats that illustrate just maybe how far some of our key things that we used to do really well have fallen, and maybe why we're at rock bottom and how we got here. And for full disclosure, I love the Badgers. You know that. And I think next year is going to be better. I think we start crawling out of this, but this is rock bottom. I also want to point out that my fandom started 93, 94, which is convenient. I know that's when Barry Alvarez turned the program around, but I was 9, 10 years old at that point. That's when you get into it. And so I don't remember the Don Morton era. I don't remember the 80s. I know we've had worse, but in my fandom, this is rock bottom. Let's talk about it. Obviously, the bowl streak is over, 22 straight years. It's so easy to get to a bowl game nowadays. There's so many of them. You don't even need a winning record if you get good grades. Minnesota has proven that. It's absolutely insane. So that's the first one. Like, that streak's over. We used to be up on that leaderboard every year. The most continually successful, consistent programs, that's done. Take a big giant eraser to that. Let's talk some metrics. I want to talk some stats here because when I look back at Badgers' success, especially recently, the last 10, 15 years, what has it been? It's been running the ball, like having a dynamic bell cow running back, having a really good tight end, solid, okay-ish quarterback play, but not terrible, and then disruptive defensive players, linebackers, defensive linemen, inside linebackers, whatever it is. Let's look at those things. Let's look at those bedrocks, those foundations of Badger football, and just talk about, like, we all know it's fallen off. Like, everyone's going to start the show and say, well, yeah, of course it's bad. But let's actually look at it for a second. Let's start with running backs. Back-to-back years, the Badgers haven't had a 1,000-yard rusher. Like, think about that. 2 straight years, the Badgers haven't had a 1,000-yard rusher. That hasn't happened one time since 2015, and it's happened every year outside of 2015, going back to like 2024 or 2004. And they haven't done it back-to-back years. It's happened like twice in the last 20 years prior to these last 2 years. You have to be able to run the ball at Wisconsin. You have to, even Longo coming in, we all talked about it. You still got to be able to run the ball, right? You can't just abandon that. And I'm not saying Longo abandoned it, but 2 straight years, you don't have a 1,000-yard rusher, and it's not because your studs got hurt. That's not good enough, man. That's part of why Grimes is here, to reestablish that running game, because that's just not going to work. You got to have a bell cow. Barring injury, you got to have a guy that's going for 1,200 yards, 1,300 yards, or 2 guys that are going for like 800 apiece, which works. That hasn't been the case either. That's got to get better. That's insane to me. Back-to-back years without a 1,000-yard rusher at Wisconsin. How about this one? What the hallmark I talked about? Tight end production. Think of the lineage there. Kendricks, Garrett Graham, Owen Daniels, Travis Beckham, Jake Ferguson. You can go on and on and on. There's always been good tight end play. Back-to-back, 3 straight years. So going back to the end of the Paul Chryst era, 3 straight years the Badgers haven't had a tight end catch more than 15 balls. They haven't had a tight end break the 20 catch mark in 3 straight years. Insane. That hadn't happened since 2005 at Wisconsin, prior to these last 3 years. So basically 20 years, the Badgers have broken that streak. And you go back to that 2005 team, the last team that didn't have a tight end catch over 20 balls, that team had Brandon Williams, that team had Brian Calhoun, that team had Jonathan Orr. So they were finding other guys to throw the ball to. That wasn't the case this year, where we just had a bunch of NFL guys, skill guys everywhere, so you didn't have to throw to the tight end. It's back-to-back years where you haven't been able to get any production from the tight end spot at Wisconsin. That's insane. That's 3 straight years without a tight end being productive. That's like saying for 3 straight years Culver's hasn't found a burger that works. Like, it doesn't even make sense. This is Wisconsin. And Longo liked tight ends, and you can get those tight ends here, and there's a history of it here. That doesn't make any sense to me. That's got to get fixed. And I do think I like the young talent there. Listen, they brought in Tanner Koziel, who caught 94 balls last year. You think they're not aware of this? You think they're not looking at that back, haven't had a tight end have any production thing? Yeah, they went out and got a guy who caught 94 passes. Unbelievable. Like, that's absolutely insane. Here's another one. Back-to-back years, the Badgers haven't had a guy with at least 5 sacks. In back-to-back seasons, no player on the Badgers has had 5 sacks in back-to-back years. You have to go back to 2013 to find a single season where a Badger defender hasn't had more than 5 sacks. You have to go back a decade to find that lack of production, and we've done it back-to-back. Every key metric that Wisconsin's been really good at has basically fallen apart recently. Everything that has made Wisconsin kind of unique or good. And you didn't need to stick with Wisconsin. This is not an argument for that. You could have modernized and kept some of this. And we're going to get into kind of where the culpability lies here. But back-to-back seasons without 4 sacks or a 5-sack guy. And even that 2013 team that didn't have a 5-sack guy, they had Chris Borland. They finished with 60-something tackles for loss, which would have been 20 more than this year's team. So even that team was far more disruptive than this team. So let's see. You don't have back-to-back years without a 1,000-yard rusher, back-to-back years without a tight end that works, back-to-back years without a disruptive defender, horrific quarterback play this last season, 16th in the Big Ten in passer rating. Like, those are all the things that Wisconsin used to not do. And then let's just talk about this. One of the best metrics, if you really want to talk about talent, what does the NFL tell you? Right? What does the NFL tell you about the talent level on the team the last several years? I went over to look at NFL Mock Database does a great job. There's a website. They combine every mock draft into one consensus big board. This is what we're looking at for the 2025 draft for the Badgers. The top player that they have for the Badgers is Jack Nelson at 156. So essentially a 5th rounder, early 5th round for Jack Nelson is the top rated Badger coming into the 2025 draft per the mock draft consensus. 5th round. That's the top NFL draft eligible guy. Now, listen, that's mock drafts change. That's not a perfect metric, but it's also probably relatively accurate, give or plus or minus a round, right? A 5th rounder. That's the top NFL pick on this team right now. The next guy listed is Wohler, who I love Wohler, but he's listed as a 7th rounder, number 218 on the consensus. So you're talking about a team that the NFL says, yeah, I think there's a 5th and a 7th round talent on that roster right now that I can draft. There's younger guys that I think can grow into that role. I'm not saying that's indicative of the roster as a whole, but for the upperclassmen, that's what the NFL is looking at. That's what scouts are looking at. Go back to last year. Again, this is not a single year problem. This has been building for a couple years. We're going to get into that on this show, but go back to last year. Two draft picks, 2 4th rounders last year, Bordeaux and Braylon Allen. That's it. Not a 3rd, not a 2nd, not a 1st. How about this? In the last 7 years, the Badgers have not had a 1st round pick. Now, you don't need to win with a bunch of those. The Badgers have proven they can do more with this. They can do more than the sum of their parts, but you still need some dudes, right? You still need a couple guys who on the edge can win an elite matchup, who in the trenches can just bulldoze somebody. In the last 7 years, the Badgers haven't had a 1st round pick. So again, this goes back a ways. The previous 7 years, they had 7, right? Listen to this list. The last 7 years, the Badgers haven't had a single 1st round pick. The previous 7 years, it was the Watts, it was Karimi, it was Frederick, it was Ramczyk. Like, where are those dudes? It was Melvin Gordon. They're not on this roster at the upper levels, and maybe they are on the lower levels, and that's still developing. And I've said it a bunch. I love what this staff has done in recruiting. The 24 class, the 25 class, it's building. But you want to talk about kind of the downfall and how we got to rock bottom? There you go. There's no NFL talent at the upper levels, and especially no elite NFL talent. The tight end play has fallen off. There's no disruptive edge guys for the last couple of years. No 1,000-yard rushers. That's just not a formula that's going to work at Wisconsin unless you have an elite quarterback. And we had the opposite of that. It's like a stew with all the bad ingredients. So that's kind of where we're at. I think it's rock bottom for the Badgers. Now, all that being said, I love this program to death. I am a huge fan, as you guys know. And I do think, I just made a video today, I do think next year's better. I think we start crawling out of this, but it's important to recognize where we're at and where this program has gotten to. Coming up next, we're going to talk about what part of this is Paul Chryst's fault. But first, a quick break for our friends of the show, new friends of the show over at Intuit TurboTax. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of endless waiting, wondering, worrying about your taxes? I know I am, because that is stressful as all get out. Now that's a thing of the past, that stress, that worry. You see, taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with a TurboTax expert who can get to work on your return right away. No more waiting for answers. No more wondering if you're missing out on deductions. That's what they're there for. Whether you have one form or 20, TurboTax experts give your taxes their undivided attention. While you get real-time updates on their progress, you can focus on what really matters, which isn't you just driving yourself insane over taxes. You won't have to lift a finger, but you'll get peace of mind knowing your taxes are being handled by the pros. Are you ready for stress-free taxes, the most money back guaranteed? Head over to TurboTax.com today. Get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate so you can focus on the rest of your day. Who wakes up in the morning and is like, oh, good, I get to do taxes. The folks at TurboTax do, but I don't. That's why I go to TurboTax. Only available with TurboTax live service, real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at turbotax.com/guarantee. Again, that's turbotax.com/guarantee. All right, let's talk about Paul Chryst here. I want to talk about what part of this I lay at the feet of Paul Chryst and where this started, because that's where we're at. I think this is rock bottom, but where did it start for the Badgers? It started to me in 2021. It started towards the end of that Paul Chryst era. And Paul Chryst would still win games there. And I also want to point out, Paul Chryst won 72% of his games. He did incredible stuff here. But I think we'd be naive if we said the cracks in this foundation didn't start under his watch. It started to me when Saeed Khalif left the recruiting department. And then Paul Chryst, and he was interviewed about it. He talked about it, but Paul Chryst took 8 months to refill that spot. Excuse me, 8 months to fill a recruiting department. And we would all consider recruiting to be basically the lifeblood of a college program, the lifeblood of continual success. You have to have people in there. And he just didn't. He just didn't do it. And I think it was a little bit of arrogance on his part at times. I think it was a little bit of, I don't fully need to have those guys in that room. We've done it old school. We can do it old school again. He shifted Eric Johnson over into that role, who's had experience recruiting but wasn't actively doing it, and it felt just kind of like a stopgap. And that's how it was for a while, for about 8 months. And Eric Johnson was interviewed after, and he talked about how nice it was to kind of do it old school. Like, this was in an article on The Athletic by Jesse Temple. He talked about the staff pitching in and doing it like they used to be. And I'm like, that's not what college football is anymore. You can't do it like they used to do it. You have to have people. You have to have grinders. You can't just do it like you did in 1996. That doesn't work. And that was on Paul Chryst. That's 100% on Paul Chryst. Not being able to fill that position, not prioritizing it, not finding the right fit for it. And I think you started to see, as recruiting classes went on, I think you started to see the impacts of that. It's just not an acceptable thing. And I wasn't doing this show at the point, but I was making that point I was on 247, the boards. It's just not okay. If you have a critical spot, and it's not just a football thing. If you have a company and you have a critical spot in your company that a guy leaves, you got to fill that. You can't wait 8 months. And if you wait 8 months, then it wasn't critical. If you wait 8 months, then it's not that big of a deal. That's what you're saying by your actions. People always say, judge people by their actions, not what they say. Well, your actions are telling you that's not that big of a deal. And if you think filling that is not that big of a deal, that's a major problem. That's a huge red flag. And it's part of the reason why he lost some of the goodwill of the fans. It's part of the reason why he's gone. He didn't prioritize that position enough. There's a great example of this. Jimmy Rolder was a 4-star linebacker. He came in to visit Wisconsin, and nobody talked to him. Like, he had been in communication with the staff. He showed up for a game day visit. Should be your opportunity to knock this out of the park. This guy would eventually be a 4-star linebacker that signs with Michigan. He came to campus, came to the game day environment, and nobody on staff knew he was there. Like, that's kind of what was happening at points in that end of the era for Paul Chryst. That was just unacceptable. And then you get into other staffing decisions. You look at hiring an Al Johnson to coach running backs. Al Johnson, by every single account, is an incredible human being and probably a great offensive line coach. Played offensive line at Wisconsin. Obviously, a good culture fit with what Paul Chryst was looking for. He had never played running backs, had never coached running backs, and you brought him in to coach one of the most prestigious running back positions in college football. Bringing him in to coach running backs at Wisconsin, that's like bringing in a cornerbacks coach who had never coached cornerbacks or played cornerbacks at the University of Miami. It's like bringing in, a receivers coach to Ohio State that was a former defensive lineman. You can't do that. And again, that's something I talked about when I was on the boards. I didn't have the show at that point, but it didn't make any sense. And I can tell you, I talked to some people in that room, that running back room, afterwards, like after it had kind of gone sideways and Luke Fickell was here. And to a man, talked to multiple players, everybody said he's a great guy. But he shouldn't have been the running back coach. And we could have said that. We could have said that at the beginning. That was so you start to see this track record of coaching mishires. And what happens when there's coach mishires is you start to lose development or you start to lose developmental time. Would Braylon Allen, who didn't rush for 1,000 yards last year, been a little better if he had a better running backs coach that year? Maybe. It's impossible to say, but when you cycle through coaches, you lose recruiting continuity, you lose development continuity, you lose the ability to build continuity within your schemes and your systems. That was just a bad hire. And then you look at bringing in a Bobby Ingram, who had never coached quarterbacks, who had never been an offensive coordinator, was a receiver at Penn State, was coaching tight ends in the NFL, and you brought him in to be a quarterbacks coach. You brought him in to be an offensive coordinator. I actually got to be honest, I didn't even hate the OC part because I knew Chryst would be involved in that, and I thought Ingram would have a good grasp of offense, having played it and coached it kind of his whole life. But you can't bring him in to coach quarterbacks. There's another one where it was just baffling to me. And I talked about Kenny Guyton making the move this offseason to coach quarterbacks. At least he's played it, right? Even that one I'm a little iffy on, but at least he's played the position. Ingram had never played it, had never coached it. You're just setting Graham Mertz up for disaster. And I talked about that too. You can't expect Graham Mertz to succeed if you're never giving him quarterback coaches, if you're never allowing him to be in a spot where somebody can develop him. And if you're not giving him an experienced offensive coordinator, of course it's not going to fully work. You're not giving him it's like sending a gifted student to a school with no teachers. He's not going to get better there. So you look at Paul Chryst, and to me, it was just a combination of not prioritizing recruiting department, which started to affect the upper tier of the team that Luke Fickell would come in and inherit. So this roster that I'm going to get to Luke Fickell next. This is just where I think Paul Chryst bears some blame into where we are right now. I'm going to get into Luke Fickell next, and he certainly has a role in this too. But I think the roster that Luke Fickell ended up inheriting, filled with these Paul Chryst guys that were upperclassmen, it wasn't as strong as we thought. It wasn't as strong as Luke Fickell thought, and you were starting to see that, right? In the last 17 games of Paul Chryst's career, he went 9-8 in the Big Ten. His last game was a 34-10 loss to Illinois at home to a team that hadn't beaten Wisconsin in Madison in 20 years. Like I've always thought it was the right decision to move on from Paul Chryst. Just some recruiting malfeasance not filling in the recruiting department. And again, incredible guy. Like these aren't fun topics for me because everybody I've talked to says Paul Chryst is awesome. And he did incredible things at Wisconsin. I do think it was time. I think it was time because of coaching decisions. I think it was time because of recruiting decisions, staffing decisions, developmental decisions. I didn't think the strength and conditioning department was as strong. I thought his in-game coaching stuff, you go back to the end of that Minnesota game where he couldn't decide if to punt, to take a timeout, then burned the timeout, then ended up going for it. It felt like it was all coming apart, quite frankly. And then the last one I would talk about, Paul Chryst, who for a time had a renowned reputation as a quarterback developer, as a guy who was developing quarterbacks, who was building that room, who could identify and coach them up. And there was tangible success there. You look at it, some of the success he had with a Russell Wilson, who came from NC State and instantly got better at Wisconsin. You look at a Scott Tolzien, who completed 72% of his passes under Paul Chryst. That reputation was earned. But then you look at that last bit of his Wisconsin time. In 2019, he landed Graham Mertz. Amazing. But then he didn't develop him. That was a great recruiting win, elite recruiting win. But then he didn't develop him. And then in 2020, he didn't take a guy. You can't not take a quarterback every year. And I talked about that again at the time. I know some of the people are like, sure, do you have receipts of that? But no, I don't. But I'm telling you, you don't not take a quarterback because you landed a highly ranked prep guy the year before. Because prep quarterbacks fail all the time. You have no idea if Graham Mertz is going to be their guy or not. You have to take a quarterback every year. They didn't take one in 2020, which would lead to issues down the road. You have to take a quarterback every year. You maybe should take two every year. Get more in the room and just see what happens. But not taking a quarterback in 2020, massive mistake. Then 2021, his quarterback was Deacon Hill. And in 2022, he was Miles Burkett. You're not going to win. You're not going to win like that. Unless you have peak Melvin Gordon in the backfield and an elite offensive line and kind of a soft schedule, you're not going to win games like that. If in 4 years, your three quarterbacks are Graham Mertz, Deacon Hill, and Miles Burkett, like that's it, right? That you wonder how Wisconsin started the downward slope. And again, this isn't to lay it all on Paul Chryst at all, because Paul Chryst, it's not all on Paul Chryst at all. But that's a contributing factor. That's the roster that Luke Fickell is going to inherit. And there wasn't a quarterback on the roster that was going to be successful, meaning you had to instantly retool that spot. All right, we're going to pause there, take a quick break for our friends of the show, and I'm going to come back and tell you how Luke Fickell, in my opinion, misjudged this roster and where he maybe messed up initially. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick break for our friends of the show over at FanDuel. FanDuel is the #1 source for all your sports betting needs. They are fast, simple, and easy to use. It's one of the reasons I love them. From big upsets to game-winning drives, NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and much, much more. One of my favorite things about FanDuel is it's just so easy to use. It's so easy to get your money out when you win. I've used some other sites, and I'm telling you, it feels like even if you win, you're never going to see a dime. That's not FanDuel. It's safe. It's secure. It's simple. I've gotten payouts from it. It's fast. It is everything you want. That's why we use it. That's why it's the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network, the official sportsbook of the NFL. If you were going to trust the NFL, like that's big time endorsements right there. Locked On, the NFL. That's why we use it. It's fast, simple, easy to use. Just visit FanDuel.com today to join. Get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, let's finish this off. Let's talk about Luke Fickell and kind of where I think his culpability kind of lies in all this. So a couple things. Again, I think we're at rock bottom, and I'm just kind of trying to trace the line of how we got there. And I do think I think we're going to climb out of this. I do. I'm an optimistic fan. I love this program. I like what we've done this offseason, but that doesn't change where we're at right now. And where we're at right now is in a great spot. So I think initially Luke Fickell misjudged the roster. Here's specifically where I think he misjudged it. I think you had to come in and do one of two things if you're Luke Fickell. If you wanted to flush it all, like kind of like to take the Deion Sanders model where you come in, you're going to get a bunch of people off the roster, you're going to bring in a bunch of transfers, you're going to change everything up. Cool, do that. But then do that. Or you come in and and he talked about doing this, but I don't know if he fully did. You come in and you kind of merge what Wisconsin was done with what you've done. Cool, then do that. Instead, he kind of tried to walk a middle ground. Like all new coaches, no coach with Wisconsin ties, brand new offensive coordinator running a brand new system, brand new defensive coordinator running a brand new defensive system, but I also want to keep most of this roster. You can't, he tried to walk both lines. And at the time, I don't think a lot of people faulted him for it. But I think a lot of us also thought this roster was better than it was. I think a lot of us also thought this roster was more talented than it was and that you could do that. And what we saw was parts that were kind of meant for a different system, trying to be forced into new systems, players that had loyalties to coaches that were no longer there, being forced to kind of adjust to these new coaches and some of the players they brought in. And ultimately, it was like oil and water. It didn't work. If you had come in and just flushed it, said, no, we're doing something different. We're going to run the air raid. We're going to run this. Kind of hit not for lack of a better word, but kind of hit the road if you're not with it. I think you would have initially had probably some PR issues. Like people would have been frustrated seeing a lot of Badger players leave, but you probably would have had a more aligned roster. You probably had players that fit what they're trying to do better. You probably would have had less cultural issues. I think there were issues in the locker room. There were divided loyalties. Players have talked about that. Hunter Wohler's talked about that. This isn't news. And I think he tried to walk the middle ground. And by walking the middle ground, he really it wasn't going to work. You had to pick one or the other. And I think that was a mistake on his part. Like if he had wanted to do the road of, all right, let's integrate more with Wisconsin, you got to keep Jim Leonhard as a DC. I think there was an opportunity there. I don't think there's an issue between Fickell and Jim Leonhard, by the way. I think they have no issues whatsoever. But I think you should have come in and made every single effort, stay on at DC for a year, whatever it takes. And that would have been a great way to maybe maintain some of that culture, maintain some of what Wisconsin was, and mesh what you're doing. But we all know that didn't happen. I think the other thing that's obvious is there's been coaching mishires. Longo was a massive mistake. And the fact that a year and a half in, you fired your offensive coordinator along with the offensive line coach last year that he picked. The offense has been in shambles. The passing game has been in shambles. Longo hasn't been able to fix the passing game. That was a massive mistake. And in 2 years, we've cycled through, I think, let's see here. It's 2 years we've cycled through Longo, Bicknell, Scruggs, Brown, Hitch, Grinch. Now, not all of those were fired for, not all of those were cycled off for bad reasons. Some of those coaches took promotions. Some of those coaches went elsewhere. But that's a lot of turnover in 2 years. And that Longo hire was a big one. I think the other thing where there's been a mistake is the portal evals. I talked about it earlier on the show. If you look back at what they brought in the portal last year, how many of those guys were real hits? I think I did a show that said 3 or 4 of them. Certainly a Tyree Walker was a hit. There's a couple other ones. Elijah Hills was a hit, but the linebacker group wasn't good enough. Brandon Lane wasn't much of a hit. There were some issues at receiver that weren't. I mean, again, so it's portal acquisitions haven't been a hit. I think coaching hires have been a bit of a misfire at times, and there's been too much cycling through the positional coaches. Once again, there's a new safeties coach this year, who I really like, Jack Cooper, by the way, but you got to build some continuity. And that's the point I made with Paul Chryst and his positional coaches. Even if coaches are leaving for promotions, if you're constantly having churn, I don't think you're building continuity. I don't think you're building continuity in the scheme. I don't think you're building continuity on the recruiting trail. I don't think you're building continuity in player development. You have to find a couple guys that are young and upcoming that will stay for a while. And I think Kenny Guyton could be that guy. I think Reed, the new receivers coach, can be that guy. I think Blazek is that guy. I think Whitlow could be that guy. I like a lot of the younger hires he's made recently, but off the jump, there were some issues on the coaching staff that he brought in. So, yeah, it's a combination of the last couple of years of Paul Chryst, this era of Luke Fickell, but this is Badgers football rock bottom. Now, I would say again, I'm optimistic that we're coming out of this. I think this offseason was a good one. I think it was better than last year. I think they were a little more strategic with where they wanted to go. I like the quarterback. Assuming he's not going to get hurt, which again, the Badgers have had 2 straight years of losing their starting quarterback that they brought in. So that's been rough. Assuming he's not going to get hurt, I think you're going to have a better version of this Badgers team this year, but you got to start seeing it. Because if you don't start crawling out of rock bottom, you don't get out of there, and then it's harder and harder. The longer you are in the swamp of sadness, the further it sinks you in. So you got to break out of that this offseason. And it doesn't mean 8 wins. It doesn't mean 9 wins, because I don't think that's realistic, but it means a better product. It means the 42-10 Iowa game doesn't happen. It's 27-23, and who cares who wins? But it's competitive. You're back to that program that's gonna be competitive in every game. You're back to that program who is not going to get pushed around the field. And it's got to happen this year, because I love this program, man. This is not meant as like a sourful show. I love this program, and I can't wait for this season where I think we are going to start climbing out of the spot that we're in right now. Anyway, I really do appreciate everybody tuning in. When you're done here, go check out Locked On Big Ten, all the biggest stories over there, from conference realignment to obviously the playoff news, everything over there on the Locked On Big Ten channel. Go check them out. Thank you so much for listening, as always, on Wisconsin, and we will talk tomorrow.